You know you deserve more. You've been patient, but with no time left, you turn toward the Lord of Change. Magics and schemes, knowledge and wisdom flood your mind, intoxicating your mind deeper and deeper into a web of insanity. Your thoughts now brilliant, powerful, with unimaginable foresight. But these realities are merely the manipulations to position you as a pawn in Tzeentch's grand scheme. Welcome to the Tzeentch Mastery Guide, where we will quickly and concisely run through the entire faction at legendary level with a bit of added lore and some formations. I have a Tzeentch tier list and Kairos guide which I recommend as subsequent viewing after this, but it will all be linked at the end of the video. And yes, we're going to touch on Village and the Warriors of Chaos because they all interconnect. Now let's jump straight into the race, starting with Tzeentch's strengths. Tzeentch, the Lord of Change, the Architect of Fate, and the Changer of Ways. He is the god of scheming, magic, and deception, and this comes on full display by having unmatched casting, having no shortage of Lord or Hero casters to fill every single army, and the ability to bolster the winds of magic on and off battlefield. They also have the Lore of Tzeentch, their unique Lore of Magic. I recommend using the blue fire on characters, elite infantry and cavalry, whilst using the pink fire of Tzeentch on light infantry, and you can overcast it if the shot is good to really clear out some chaff. Heavy armor can be a bit of a challenge, especially in the early game, but luckily the Lore of Metal will give you Plague of Rust to reduce the enemy armor, as well as a really great bombardment spell with Searing Doom. Another trademark strength of Tzeentch is magical attacks, with every single melee strike or projectile being classed as a magic attack means these attacks will go straight through the enemy physical resistance, but that is simply a bonus compared to the iconic Tzeentch barriers. Tzeentch's energies are always in flux, always evolving, a literal force field which will protect every single one of your units, and so long as they're not hit and they stay out of battle, that force field will recharge, and this has several applications. Your frontliners, when getting beat up, can be pulled back, and whilst recovering their stamina can also recharge their shield, so they'll be able to duck back in and last a little bit longer. It's also very useful on flying units, which are another strength of Tzeentch. You will see yourself using quite defensive formations on the ground because the reach of your armies is done through flyers and casting spells, and having barriers on these flying units will make them last that much longer, able to cycle charge or position casting units to deal that decisive spell. Whilst the demon units are somewhat glass cannon, the mortal armor and halberds are your signature muscle and stopping power. Chaos Warriors provide some much needed line holding to the race in the early game, and in the late game you will have the Chosen wielding their iconic Halberds of Tzeentch. Tzeentch's economy is a bit slow burn, but it stacks multipliers on top of multipliers, which results in some insane bonuses in the late game. Just a quick reminder guys, if you are enjoying the video, please consider liking and subscribing, it really helps out. Ask any question in the comments, I answer everything, and if you'd like to talk strategy, feel free to join the Discord. Cheers. So since you start slow in the early game, the few armies you do have will be able to deal decisive damage with the incredibly powerful teleport stance. Arguably the most powerful stance in the entire game. You can teleport through or past any obstruction and deal an unstoppable ambush attack on top of your target. Now yes, this will lower your winds of magic for the upcoming battle, but you start surrounding them and will be able to eviscerate their army. Use the various skills and channeling stance to rebuild your wins, because one decisive use of this stance can decide an entire war. The final strength is the biggest one, and that is Tzeentch's Changing of the Ways. The ability to manipulate the fates of yourself as well as the enemies around the map. You'll have to unlock most of these powers through your research tree as the game progresses, but these are incredibly strong and overcome all of Tzeentch's limitations if used properly. You can hold an enemy in place for 2 turns, you can break alliances, force peace. Grimoires are the exclusive resource used on these Changing of the Ways abilities, and they're predominantly gained from winning battles, but also Lord skills and cults. More on that later. Certain lords have access to different Changing of the Ways, but we'll get to that as soon as we uncover the weaknesses and how we can best overcome them. The most pressing and obvious weakness is unstable demons. Once the barrier drops, some units like flamers are incredibly frail. Being demons, they won't rout, but instead they become unstable and will eventually crumble and banish from this plane, quite similar to undead units. Whilst having units that will fight to the death does have some advantages, it is actually quite frustrating in campaign to have your units go below a certain threshold and you know they will likely crumble to death, losing all of that experience in the process. Fortunately, Ultimately, if you have the Champions of Chaos DLC, you will have access to all of the amazing mortal units, but most of all, at least the basic Chaos Warrior with the sword and shield in the formative turns, available at tier 3, will carry you all the way through the early and even the mid game. Even in my mid to late game armies, I field these as my main front line to keep the cost down, and then fielding some chosen halberds to do the heavy hitting. The reason why Chaos Warriors are so good under Tzeentch is because any mortal that dedicates themselves to him gets the Mark of Tzeentch, which grants the magical attacks and the magical barrier, just like a demonic unit. Another weakness is their lack of long-range artillery. Now, whilst Tzeentch is the definitive caster which has the best missiles of all the Chaos Gods, he is still a short to mid-range faction that mainly just stands out because the rest of his contemporaries are a bunch of murder-stabby melee units. Against some enemies, you're likely to be at a range disadvantage if they have artillery, but just remember your flyers have barrier, which means they can fly around, bait out and distract enemy artillery, and if they get hit, just recharge that barrier and keep on distracting. But even still, if they have bows or crossbows, they will still outrange your horror units, meaning you will need to move in the defensive formation, utilizing precise aggression with your flying and casting units. And while Tzeentch's late game roster has a plethora of units that can handle many situations, his early game units are very specialized with clear strengths and weaknesses, meaning you'll need the right blend of army to counter the right type of threat to get the synergy you'll need out of your units. For example, horror units provide range support but lack some stopping power. Flamers have great armor-piercing damage to large blobs, but they're extremely brittle. Screamers are mobile and deal excellent anti-large damage, but once their charge wears off, they're a sitting duck. Unfortunately, what I'm trying to say is Tzeentch are very micro-heavy and are one of the more advanced battlefield armies to play. To deal with this, you'll want to hotkey your lords and casters 1 or 2 so you can quickly fly around the battlefield unleashing spells. This is a great habit to also have on your flying units, and if you're not using them, there's nothing wrong with keeping your flyers in reserve at the back of your army because they won't be there if you go to find them later. Now, whilst Tzeentch's late game economy snowballs on a stack of multipliers, the early game is going to be quite difficult. Tzeentch are designed to be played tall, not expansive in the early game. You're meant to either reach out with vassals or cults until you get yourself up to a strong tier 4 or maybe even tier 5 army, and then the world is your oyster and you will more than catch up on lost time. Another weakness that seems relatively par for the course with demonic armies is of course diplomacy. Being restricted from trade and having to use gifts just to keep enemies in common, you'll have to be very careful when managing the geopolitics, but Tzeentch has the changing of the ways that can circumvent a lot of this. But as long as you utilize these abilities, there's not too much that can exploit you. However, just keep in mind Tzeentch does have a weakness to enemy ambushes. An army in ambush stance isn't visible to you, so it cannot be the target of your teleportation stance. Also, particularly in the early game, those demonic units do not like being enveloped and flanked. Dealing melee damage is not Tzeentch's strong suit in the early stages, and the final weakness is the Tzeentch factions do tend to get their legendary heroes comparatively very late, and this is because both of them require a tier 4 building to be constructed. Now, this isn't that bad because you're about to see Tzeentch have some of the fastest growth mechanics in the entire game, but it will take you some time. But is it worth pushing up that growth just for 2 heroes? Well, yes. They can both be recruited by Tzeentch and the Warriors of Chaos, so let's go through them. First up, Tzeentch's highly trusted Blue Scribes. Now, Tzeentch originally became the strongest of all the Chaos Gods until the other 3 greater gods allied and defeated him. Upon his defeat, the energies of his thoughts and being were crystallized and shattered throughout the dimensions, and the Blue Scribes were tasked to collect these shards as well as pen down all arcane knowledge that they came across. This most delicate and trusted of tasks was deliberately bestowed on 2 horrors that would endlessly bicker and cannot agree on which spell to cast and when. They can learn spells from every single lore, and a single cast will refresh all 6 spells with 6 others based on the lores you've already learned. But here's the trick, only learn the lore of life at least until the mid game. This means you will only rotate between Tzeentch and life magic, and getting life magic is incredibly powerful. Save up enough points until you can complete the entire line and then get the cataclysm spells because they're fun. The scribes themselves can be buffed up to be very powerful with their range attacks on the battlefield, but most notably can power up horror units to punch way above their pay grade. Their quest involves you getting 500 captives. Fighting manual battles is the easiest way to get this. Auto-resolve tends to produce pretty paltry numbers of captives. After this, just get a tier 4 library and the game will point out a random settlement not too far from you. Simply run a hero over to it or transfer it into your control. The other legendary hero giving solid line holding, replenishment and battlefield healing is Akold Hellebron. He buffs Chaos Warriors and Chosen, but most notably, getting those armored Chosen, putting them on a flying disc of Tzeentch, Akold will give them damage reflection, so make sure you put 2 of these in the army. Get your faction leader up to level 12 and his quest battle will become available after you build the tier 4 barracks as well as 8 Chaos Warriors. Pretty easy stuff. Now to cover the characters that can lead the armies, but first let's go through the non-legendary lord options, and if you're one of the demonic leaders, i.e. the changeling or Kairos, you can get a Herald of Tzeentch, basically a miniature Lord of Change, can summon some units and ultimately level up to be an exalted Lord of Change. The most useful ability is the Gaze of Tzeentch, allowing you to pin a troublesome unit in place, making them fodder for your flamer units. You get 3 casts of this, so it's very powerful, but for Tzeentch, having good line holders and a good duelist is usually worth way more, which is why going for a Chaos Lord, or in my preference a Chaos Sorcerer, is the better option. They come with incredibly high armor, using the Law of Metal or the Law of Tzeentch to deal damage. Get enough levels on this Lord and they can ascend to immortal demonhood and become a Demon Prince, a melee powerhouse and a great caster. Now, as for the legendary lords, they all play completely differently, more than any other faction. So bear with me, I'm going to go through each of these and outline the distinctions between them. Now let's start off with Kairos, the fan favorite, and a suitable first faction because Tzeentch has a hard learning curve regardless. He is the premier user of the Changing of the Ways and can do so via using cults to generate lots and lots of grimoires. Kairos is Tzeentch's greatest Lord of Change and his vizier. Deep in the realms of Tzeentch lies the Well of Eternity, which holds the secrets of time and space. One day Tzeentch thought, I wonder what'll happen if I throw this here Lord of Change down that there hole. And Kairos somehow survived the LOLs experiment and his head was sundered in 2, one seeing infinite past and the other the infinite futures. Being able to document endless possibilities, he is blind to the present but is a near demigod on the battlefield and arguably the strongest caster in the game. On the campaign map, he can transfer the winds of magic, providing strong secondary bonuses for every single building. The winds will gradually increase in your provinces. Once they tick up to the 6th and final stage, reduce the winds by 1 and place them in a new and developing province to take advantage of the incredible growth buildings at his disposal. Being the strongest user of the Changing of the Ways, he has all the powerful demonic abilities: Force Peace, Force War, Halt Army, but his specialty is having enough grimoires to frequently transfer settlements between friends, between enemies, or straight to yourself. His signature unique ability is Double Time, allowing him to move and even attack twice in the same turn. He can confederate sartorial on turn 4, see the guide on how to do this. Kairos gains benefit from having reinforcing armies following him, so even just having sartorial trailing behind Kairos' army will allow you to hit extra hard with an exalted Lord of Change whilst leveling him up in the process. Kairos' foresight allows reinforcements to enter the battle even quicker, and his Law of Metal is very useful to bring down enemy armor. It's also worth noting, every time you reinforce a battle with a second lord, you have the chance to gain the follow, which will increase your relations with other Tzeentchian factions, making those confederations even easier. Just don't forget to equip them to your heroes. The Changeling is the trickster and the most unique campaign in all of Warhammer 3. Rather than conquest, his campaign revolves around enacting schemes and laughing hysterically at the chaining result of destructive events. As his name would imply, the Changeling can defeat any lord and then take their likeness. And on the battlefield, he specializes in efficiently fielding the allied units, resulting in some really dynamic gameplay, which is kind of ironic because he's trying to take down all of his allies with cults from the inside. This is because rather than conquering, all of his buildings exist underneath existing settlements. These cults gradually corrupt the inhabitants as hosts for the Lord of Change. Having a cult in a territory will make all of your armies invisible to the enemy. Consequently, he can power up settlements even faster than Kairos due to not needing population surplus. But you still need to invest wisely to expand, but essentially build symbiotic cults in large capitals to drain the treasury. Then build parasitic economy buildings to bolster your wealth in minor settlements. As always with cults, increase that spread percentage chance because this doesn't damage the host city, which means you can extract more wealth from it. And every structure you build underneath the settlement adds a percentage chance of being detected, so keep it below 100% discoverability, but keep in mind each hero nearby can increase that, and once discovered the owner can pay to demolish it. The changeling enjoys most of the standard changing of the ways, but can also spread corruption, and corruption is quite useful. Armies in an area where Tzeentch corruption is high will enjoy more ammunition and higher winds of magic. The changeling's unique campaign isn't for everyone, but if you're into Tzeentch and everything he's about, you'll enjoy traversing through the rifts, enacting chaos, and watching the world burn itself to pieces. Our final Tzeentch Lord is actually classed as a warrior of Chaos faction. See, Tzeentch's influence on mortal folk is renowned from being one of the hardest to detect. It can stir in anyone that's disaffected, anyone who wants more, feels unjustly wronged or slighted by chance. But saying that, demons are also not immune. Tzeentch convinced the mighty bloodthirster Skarbrand that his power and place were above Khorne, and emboldened Skarbrand to overthrow the god, which led to the biggest fiery bitch slap in history, tricking Khorne into disfiguring one of his most powerful warriors. But Tzeentch sings to the weak as well. Just like the frail, sickly boy village, who is reviled by his Norscan tribe, who detest weakness in their men who must be strong enough to provide and defend for their kin in the harshest of conditions. Highly intelligent but socially shunned, Village jealously despised his brother Tommen, Tommen being the exact opposite, physically impressive and respected as a natural leader. One day the Raven God heard Village's prayers to swap the brothers' positions, but there's always a catch. Rather than swapping the brothers, Tzeentch fused them together forever, twisting Village into a demonic arcane caster, fused to his brother who was stripped of all of his free will, acting like a mindless husk. Village was finally in charge, but forever bound to the one he despised most. Village is able to capitalize on the teleport stance more than any other lord, not only being the cheapest to use, but he can also use his changing of the ways to facilitate it. He can drain the magic reserves of one army into his own, stealing enough wins to use the teleport stance more often. He can use muddled minds to lower the enemy's ambush defense chance, making said teleport attack an all-out slaughter. He's able to make Chaos Spawn cheaper, able to drop 3 in any army. Since Village is technically a warrior of chaos, he follows their building system, where essentially you only want to take the fortresses for yourself, only temporarily using the minor settlements to bolster your combat in adjacent provinces before handing them over to your vassals, who will level up those provinces and you get to extract tribute from them. Being mortal, Village has weaker changing of the ways, but he can pray to chaos and give gifts to chaos and receive those advantages. You will want to level up your marauders more quickly so you can convert them into chaos warriors and ultimately chosen. The most key strategy is using your gifts of Tzeentch to get demonic units on the battlefield. When you start your campaign, use the Screamer gift, immediately add a Screamer unit to your army. In 3 more turns, you'll be able to add another, and then remove that gift so it stops draining your income. Level up some more, get some pink horrors in there when you're ready for some flamers, and once you've added the units you need, feel free to go back to the research buff, gaining new slots for more gifts, the ability to upgrade your warriors into chosen, more research buffs, and if you've always dreamt of an unstoppable host of armored chaos warriors, you can do it here. Village can also quite easily gain another hero in Harold Hammerstorm, who can gain another excellent buff to armor on all of his Chaos Warriors. Tzeentch's heroes are typically best placed inside of his armies to bolster their combat capability, namely the Exalted Champions, which anyone can get, and they are absolutely worth putting one in every single army. Exalted Champions are mortals who have pleased the Raven God so much they have received the mark of Tzeentch and been supersized into hideous mutants, able to wield the trademark halberd of Tzeentch like a toothpick. They provide some excellent line holding potential, but also will increase your casualty replenishment, which you will want plenty of to make sure your units don't dissolve into dust, as well as increasing the barrier replenishment of your entire army. Each army will also benefit from a Chaos Sorcerer. They are honestly just a hero version of the Lord Sorcerer, but they obviously can't ascend to demonhood. I like to have variety of my laws of magic, so if I have my Sorcerer on the Law of Metal, I will have my Iridescent Horror on the Law of Tzeentch for the coverage. Now, the Iridescent Horror is the most plentiful hero you will come across. It has casualty replenishment, again very useful, and whilst it doesn't act as a front line holder, it is very nimble with a ranged attack. Both of these units can fly around on a disc of Tzeentch, being difficult to hit, protected by a barrier, everything you could want in a caster hero. The final hero is the Cultist of Tzeentch, and they specialize in the Law of Fire and can ultimately go on a Chaos War Shrine, bolstering the damage of your casters. Kairos in particular can leave a cult to devastating effect, but essentially build a 10-turn structure which gives a cult magus. They can be deployed and build a structure which deploys 3 random cults across the entire map. As always, keep building networks and letting those cults naturally expand, and you will have an expanse of several cults, generating you countless grimoires per turn to unleash several changing of the ways. Whichever lord you start off with, just remember to be patient. You want to reach out with vassals or cults rather than trying to snowball the entire map. Just take your time and prioritizing your research, and by turn 70, nothing will be able to touch you. The one exemption is Village, who does want to be relatively aggressive to keep the income of souls coming, but hey, mortals have to pay the price. We're going to go through a few formations, but first I just want to quickly touch on the structure of your military through tiers 1 to 5, regardless of who you go. Essentially, once you reach tier 3, you want a front line of Chaos Warriors with shields. These are your bread and butter line holder for the majority of the game, and act as an anvil. So what's the hammer? Well, your flying units and your magic are. But these must be used in tandem with flamers, and dealing indispensable damage to large blobs of units. I only recommend having 2 units of flamers in any given army and possibly 1 unit of exalted flamers down the back. The regular flamers deal AoE to large clusters and clumps of infantry, whilst the exalted version is great at sniping down enemy units or monsters. Have a couple of gaps in your front line and place regular flamers there to blast shots of fire in between. If they're getting shot with arrows, pull them back because all flamers are glass cannons. The Chosen with halberds are a great one-stop shop that can wreck absolutely anything, but they're a bit expensive, so feel free to use a regular Chosen. I get around this by using a front row of Chaos Warriors with shields to take the hits and then send the halberds barreling in. Now, welcome to the formation section of the video. This is normally its own entire video, but honestly the algorithm will slaughter me if I make any more Tzeentch videos, so we're going to have to compact it in here. But check out formation guides for all the other races I've covered thus far. But here we're going to go through the early all the way to the late game formations, showing some similar motifs so you can understand the faction. First of all, the pink horrors of Tzeentch. There is a huge misconception that you can carry your entire game on horror units. They are a hybrid unit, but they won't handle every single situation, and as you see, they've only got 130 range, so they will be outranged by many other contemporaries, but they've got great range for chaos. I've also included in here a couple of blue horrors. What will happen is you will lose a few units every now and then you'll be able to replace them just about anywhere with blue horrors. So these are the happy, maniacal, jovial pink horrors, but when they die, they split into 2 pink horrors. Well, in the lore that's what happens, but here they just have them represented as a separate unit with twice as many bodies, but it does make them quite useful for line holding. They won't hold for that long. Their stats are pretty good for a sort of tier 1, tier 0 unit, but they're not going to last forever. So they are an emergency unit. So let's just pull these guys back as basically a last line of defense to hold on to our pink horrors. But what do we want as our front line? If you're desperate, use the blue horrors, but if possible, use Chaos Warriors. And we're going to stretch the 2 of them as wide as we can to make the center of our front line. Now, why are we doing this? Because we can then get another 2 stretched out with a gap in the middle on both sides, on both flanks, and in this gap is where we will place our flaming units. So don't stretch them all the way wide. You want them as basically a box like that, moving in your blue horrors, and then place the other one in this gap. This will allow them to get a nice clean shot on enemies on approach. You might need to retreat them back if the enemy targets them with missile units, but this really gives them the opportunity to even move around late battle and then jet into the sides of enemies against your nice staunch front line. We need to protect our flanks, so we are also using Chaos Warriors using a square formation, so if we do get attacked, they can just simply be stretched out to block whatever line comes our way. And on each flank, we're going to place in the rear a unit of Screamers. You can use Furies, but I prefer Screamers because they solve an anti-large issue, but we can also solve our anti-large issue with this Regiment of Renown unit. This is such a good Regiment of Renown, I really recommend it. It gives you amazing line holding and amazing armor piercing anti-large damage in the early game, and we're just going to place them here in reserve. If they have any dinosaurs, big monsters, we can pair them up and they will win that exchange. And at the very front of the formation, we will place our Exalted Champion of Tzeentch, and then one flank, make sure you hotkey and hot number your lords and heroes. So most of your battles will have several main stages. The first one is to make sure that you remove the artillery advantage. This can happen a couple of ways. They might move the whole army forward whilst they fire at you. Other times they'll be sitting back, and this is a chance to use your Tzeentchian barrier. Just keep on dodging around and exhaust the ammunition of the artillery. Phase 2 is the harrying stage, flying around using your magic to harass the enemy. Only do this with one caster at a time when you're still learning the faction. Even if the whole army is approaching you, you can use your shielded flying units to distract and pin while the rest of the army advances, meaning you are splitting them up into smaller forces. The flaming units getting nice clear line of sight, and then as the enemy gets close to you, charge in with your Chaos Warriors. And as we can see, by harassing the enemy early on, we've now distracted their range units, meaning we can take care of the melee units first. And as we can see, we have some large units, some horses coming through. This is where we compare our aspiring champions. Now this might happen. You see, we're getting pelted by range units because our range is comparatively quite low. This is a huge risk and one of the most difficult things about playing as Tzeentch. This is where sometimes it is worth taking the army, holding Alt, and moving it up just a little bit, but to close that range and then assign attacking orders with your frontliners. Your flying units like your screamers can be used to pile into the enemy large units, or you can use them to harass enemy archers. By utilising the heavy armour on the front line, we've managed to keep our more fragile but highly damage dealing ranged units safe, and we have won the battle. Now to show how this evolves into the mid and even late game in a very cost effective yet powerful way, let's show how these units upgrade. The pink horrors, of course, we will replace with exalted pink horrors, and this straight line of units, just make sure you put a bit of a space between them, and this will be your gun line. Even though it's short range, it will still give you some good damage saturation. We're keeping our costs down by keeping these first two units of Chaos Warriors, and then going with a gap of flamers, and then using at the very edge of the formation the chosen with halberds, and of course repeating that exact same formation over on the opposite side, and then protecting the rear, a boxed up unit of chosen repeating once again on the other side. Now you might get some units that break through, and that's why we're going to have another unit of chosen standing right behind that front line, ready to catch anyone that might break through. But another unit we want handy in reserve are these exalted flamers. Keep this unit back behind the front line, even here, and you will get your chance. They will get a nice straight line at a hero, at a large beast, and then just nuke them that way. And on the edges of the formation, we've upgraded our screamers. You can go with a couple of cockatrice for tier 3, or even later on replace them completely with Doom Knights of Tzeentch. It's great to have mobile units. So step 1, they didn't have any artillery, so we can go straight ahead to harassing them with our flying units. Moving the formation up, Control A to select everyone, and then left click and Alt to move the formation up, only just enough to move them in range. The moment that you do get into firing range, that's when we'll start sending our units around the flanks to pile in. Give that nice damage saturation. When you can see you can't be outflanked anymore, then bring your reserve chosen up to the front line. If your flames get a bit too close, move them back just a tiny bit and let them take advantage. So when a unit of flamers or something fragile gets attacked, pair up another unit and then move your flamers back so they can heal up. Plague of Rust is invaluable for lowering the armor on enemies, allowing your less armor piercing units to deal some more meaningful damage. And finally, a relatively cost-efficient Doom stack which utilizes a few low-level units to bring down the cost, and starting with the same motif of 4 horror units to provide some mid to short range damage saturation, placing in front of them in the gaps our flamers. Of course they can retreat behind that line if the enemy gets too close. But now making our front line, we will use Soul Grinders of Tzeentch. These also have a very long range attack, meaning we can now finally deal some long range damage back to the enemy. On the flanks, where the enemy might try to outmaneuver you, this is where your chosen of Tzeentch are absolutely indispensable. And this time around, because we're playing more of a tighter formation, we'll keep them boxed up so then they can be stretched out and react to the enemy's movements. On the flanks, we'll use a Burning Chariot because this will deal the anti-hero damage that maybe isn't so well done by the rest of these main units. And of course, a Lord of Change. These get incredibly powerful during campaign, so make sure you have one of these on each of your flanks, dealing some very strong damage. Heroes floating around on discs, able to do some good casting. A Cultist is handy in your army to increase the movement of it, so place him up the front, bolstering the magic damage and the Winds of Magic reserves. At the front, moving on, we have Sarthoriel. Check out the guide on how to recruit him on turn 4, using the pink fire of Tzeentch on clusters of enemy troops, and the blue fire on single entities or more elite units. The ability to dive in and deal good melee damage with your Lords of Change. Just keep them moving and keep the pressure on. And once again, a lot of your damage will come down to how well you line up your flamer units. Make sure you advance your formation to outrange their ranged units, and you should win the day quite comfortably. And if you're in a pinch, you can always summon a wall of horrors thanks to your cultists as well as your iridescent horrors. So, you are now initiated, branded with the mark of Tzeentch. Now it is time for the world to see your brilliance. From turn 1 to short victory, it was already written.